Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Salih Yilmaz. I am one of the senior energy analysts for Bloomberg Intelligence based here in Dubai. And we are delighted to have Makala Krishnan with us today, a partner at McKinsey Global Institute based in Boston. Makala, thank you very much.
Thank you, great to be here.
Great to be talking to you. So you published a report a few days ago. I want to get the name right. An affordable, reliable, competitive path to net zero.
Yes, this was my test, you passed.
Yes, and I hope I can succeed. It's great. I encourage everyone who hasn't seen it yet to take a look. It is available on the McKinsey website. And obviously, this is a very complicated topic, and I think you and I could spend hours talking about this, but I think we only have 10 minutes. And there's a lot of great insights on that paper. But I'd like to start off by asking you about, I think, this challenge of the energy trilemma. So the three pillars of energy trilemma: energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And this is something that I've heard in almost every energy conference that I've attended in the last few years. In a lot of the conversations that I had with our clients on the topic. So clearly, this is something that's on everyone's mind. But my first question to you is, how should leaders think about alleviating poverty and economic development on one hand and achieving net zero on the other? So do you see synergies, or are there more tensions?
Great, and wonderful to be here. Thanks for hosting us here. So that is indeed the question of the hour, as it were. And in many ways, these are two independently important goals, right? It's vital that the world reaches net zero emissions. It's equally vital that the world drives economic development. And in many ways, they are synergistic goals. If you think about the net zero transition, the very reason the world is undertaking the net zero transition is to avoid the buildup of physical risks and to protect lives and livelihoods, which is indeed a core development objective. So in many ways, they are intimately linked, intimately synergistic. That is one truth. It is equally true, though, that a poorly executed net zero transition could compromise a variety of objectives that are vital for economic development. If we execute the net zero transition poorly, we could compromise affordability of energy and materials. So imagine an energy system that is poorly designed, where we don't manage for the reliability of the grid, where we don't reduce battery costs. That could compromise affordability. It could compromise reliability. A poorly executed transition could also compromise competitiveness. Now, you talked about the energy trilemma. We went one step further and created an energy quadrilemma. So we talked about affordability, reliability, but also the challenge of competitiveness. For countries and companies, it's vital that the transition actually creates opportunities where, to the extent that sectors see a decline in demand and job displacement occurs, that we protect those that are most vulnerable from the transition. So there are many examples that we highlight in the research where a poorly executed transition could compromise these other objectives. Now, that's the bad news. The good news, though, is if we think about this net zero transition as not solving just one objective, which is emissions reduction, but actually solving four objectives: emissions reduction, affordability, reliability, and competitiveness. Not only do we advance development, but we do so in a way that actually accelerates the transition. Customers will be more likely to adopt low emissions products if they are affordable, cost competitive, viable. Citizens will be more likely to embrace an energy transition that ensures energy reliability, and I can go on and on and on. My father was in the Indian Navy, so I'm going to give you all a nautical metaphor, if you can bear with me. If net zero is our North Star, taking into account affordability, reliability, and competitiveness gives us a compass. It gives us a way forward to think about how we make decisions in approaching this transition.
That's brilliant. So when it comes to some of the technologies that will be necessary for the transition, especially the ones that are in early stages, sometimes prototype stages, sometimes concept stages, what measures do you think we can be taking to push the costs of these technologies down? And I know in the last 5 to 10 years, we've had a lot of technologies where we have brought the costs down quite a lot. But going from here and perhaps in the next decade, what else can we do?
Okay, so let me extend my painful nautical metaphor and apology. So we have the North Star, which is the net zero transition. We have our compass, but we also need a map, right? How do we actually achieve all of these multiple objectives that I've described? And I'll come back to your shiny objects in a minute, but for a minute, the non-shiny objects, I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug for this. There are a multitude of low emissions technologies that exist today that work, have low costs, and the world is simply not investing enough on. So examples of that include energy efficiency, reducing methane. The IPCC estimates that by 2030, about 20 gigatons of emissions, today we're emitting, if you count methane and CO2, about 55 gigatons. So by 2030, about 20 gigatons of emissions can be abated by low emissions technologies that cost less than $20 a ton. So there's a bunch of not shiny objects that we are investing less than 20% of the amount that we need to invest in. So plug for the not shiny objects. So coming to the shiny objects now. It is equally true there's another 20 gigatons or so that costs more than $20 a ton, and about another, of that, about 15 gigatons that cost more than $50 a ton to implement. And so we do need to think about how we bring down the costs of these high cost technologies that are needed to get us to net zero. One way to think about this is to look at the full stack of emissions reduction we need by 2050 and think about the viability of technologies. Many of you have probably heard the mantra that we have many of the technologies we need to get to net zero, let's get focused on deployment. And in one way, as you will see, this is a common thread that runs through my remarks, the net zero transition is often a story of on the one hand, on the other hand. So on the one hand, we do indeed have many of the technologies that we need to get us to net zero. Most of the technologies that we need to reduce emissions by 2050 are beyond the lab stage already today. So that's the one hand. But on the other hand, only 10% of them are commercially mature. Think about that. Only 10% of the technologies that we need to reduce emissions by 2050 are in the commercially mature category. This means there's 90% that is not in the commercially mature category. About half of that is in what we would call early market stage. So these are things like electric vehicles where we've started to see demonstration, but they're still started to see deployment, but they still need fundamental integration and in many cases cost reduction. And then another half of that 90% is in technologies that are in the demonstrations phase, the prototype phase. And there in particular costs are quite high and need to come down. Which brings me to your question, which is how do we actually bring costs down? When I start talking about this, people automatically think I'm an engineer by training and that I'm telling everybody to go back to the lab and start inventing. And there's certainly some of that we need to do. But we also need to find other ways to really stimulate the power of the private sector to bring costs down, to innovate, and to integrate. We need to start sending early demand signals to give them certainty that markets will exist. We need to start to create collaboration across multiple private sector entities, across small companies, large companies, and we need to set ambitious goals to drive scaling and eventually drive large-scale deployment.
That's great. I think we have a couple of minutes left. I do want to ask you another question on bottlenecks, because I think as the energy transition progresses, it's safe to assume that we will have some bottlenecks in things like materials, land, infrastructure, and I think probably most importantly, in labor. So what strategies can be employed to overcome some of these technical challenges, and I think more importantly, to quickly increase the supply of skilled labor that will be necessary?
Yeah, so this again, I think is in the, we focus a lot on shiny objects, but there's actually just real stuff we need to get going on, and bottlenecks are an example of that. The good news is it's not actually, if you think across these bottlenecks of materials, manufacturing, land, raw materials, labor, it's not a raw lack of availability. Oftentimes, for example, enough land exists, but it is issues of lead time, actually planning enough time to create the right supply chains, to skill the right labor force. So accounting for lead time and accounting for what we call concentration risks. So when we think about materials, a large portion of material refining capacity is in a few countries, and we need to think about how to unlock that. For labor in particular, we have large pools of labor that are not being deployed to the transition. And so we need to think about how do we train the workers, how do we train workers and deploy them to the areas that they need to be most deployed in.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have, but thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Great to be chatting to you. And thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.